I read a report from a Ukrainian army stating that humanoids fail dramatically in the field. 6 months ago, it was folding clothes and towels, and now it's dancing. And I wonder what's going to be in 6 months' time, maybe robots singing or whatever. But none of these things are useful. It's challenging to even teleoperate humanoids, and forget about autonomy. Those demos are, I don't want to get sued, but mostly smoke and mirrors. Robotics generally is for masochistic people that wake up to fail repeatedly every single day and on occasion succeed. When Elon Musk says that it's going to cost him at least $500 billion, I would probably add a zero and say he's not wrong. Unity is a complex case because they make hardware, but also it's a spy hardware, right? They deploy literally, CCCP agents across the world, and your job is to put them in critical areas where they could spy and snoop on you.
Tesla Optimus, theater or product?
Stations.
Tom, every machine took job from human hands and gave an easier one. This time humanoid shaped robot is taking all of them. What happens to human hands now?
Are you asking me to play a scenario what happens when or if they take over, or are you asking me if it is possible for them to take over?
Both scenarios.
Okay. Let's start with the fact that a lot of work that people do requires not just a lot of dexterity, but also a lot of sensory feedback, right? So your hand has 17,000 sensors, right? They detect not just movement or touch, but temperature, friction, deflection, and so on and so on. We can do things blindfolded with quite a lot of ease if we've done this before. It's impossible at this stage to copy that, right? We don't even know how to digitize sensation like touch and so on. We digitized voice in the 80s, right? When telephony was expanding and so on and so on. So the current AI builds on a hell of a lot of work that was done decades ago. When it comes to sensory touch, it's very early science. It's very blue sky. So I don't think you can replace most things that people do. You can pick up a lot of jobs around human activity which doesn't require a lot of sensory feedback. Pick and place, machine tending, picking items from rigs and putting them into jigs or fixtures, or emptying boxes into hoppers, let's say in manufacturing. So it's a sort of super boring, repetitive work. That can be automated, and to be fair, that should be automated because it's super, super boring thing to do. If your life revolves around picking an item 5,000 times a day and putting it somewhere else, you're going to be asking yourself some hard questions, right? So you do want to automate that, and you'll see that being automated over the next 5 years with humanoids or general purpose robots and other robots that sort of, mobits and so on. But when it comes to a more demanding work where you really need to use your hands and stretch things or clip things and so on, you can't just do it on vision. So I can't see humanoids replacing this. So when it comes to manufacturing, what could possibly happen over the next 10 years is about 25, maybe 30% of work being automated with physical AI, while the rest of the work specializing a bit more around humans' best capabilities that robots cannot copy.
Okay, one of your essays says that humanoids are just hardware. What do you mean by that?
Well, just look back at personal computers, right? When people started building them in the 80s or late 70s. And the general view in the space was, well, let's build computers and, enthusiasts can program them to do things, right? So at that point, computers literally had nothing on them, right? They were just hardware. And in order to make them provide outcome for a customer, provide any sort of value, you had to code it yourself, right? And humanoids and generally speaking, physical AI robots are not far from that point. And even last week, Unitree admitted that the sort of the GPT moment for humanoids is very far away. They just hardware. You manufacture hardware. You can put firmware to control servos and motors and so on. And you could even train basic motion like moving forward or dancing, right? But if you look at robots dancing, if you walk closer to them, they'll knock your teeth out. There is no it's a one-way traffic, right? They're following motion planning with a little bit of responsiveness to gravity, but that's about it. They can't do anything, right? So vast majority of robots that you see are pre-programmed or motion planned. There's no perception there. There is no responsiveness. There's no, on-edge inference happening. So they just pieces of hardware.
Okay, then what is the use case for humanoid robots? Has anyone answered that?
The honest answer is I can't find any, right? If you look at, I read a report from Ukrainian army that came out about 2 weeks ago, stating that humanoids fail dramatically in the field, right, in trenches, that actually wheeled robots or tracked robots are way better. And that was probably the last place where I thought, or the final chance for humanoids to prove that, they could be useful, because in the trenches, the environment is extremely bipedal oriented. And if they fail there, and they get beaten by wheeled or tracked robots, even in the trenches, in mud, in warfare, I can't honestly think of a useful case for them.
Most of the people who are criticizing the robot industry, they haven't built one, and your robots went under, I think, 4,000 British floors. What does it look like in real world?
You could look at it from both angles, right? When it comes to how to get most value out of robots and how to get most efficiency out of robots and so on, you would probably build a robot for each and every use case, and it would be specialized for that particular use case, right? And if that use case enables you to deploy thousands and thousands of robots, then you will probably get to economies of scale, right? Which means that the robots will, at some point, your manufacturing cost will arrive at a point that makes it economical to deploy, right? And floor installation is a typical case where, trying to get humanoids to crawl under the floor would be idiotic, right? There's not enough space, you've got constrained, you might have a space this shallow. You've got spaghetti of pipes and cables and, rabble and so on. And you need to design and build something that's appropriate for the application, right? I think appropriate is the right word that we're missing in robotics, right? A lot of companies chase the human form factor, which is not appropriate for the tasks that they're targeting. So Qbot is a good example. It's done probably 5,500 floors by now. It's where robots are designed to work within the space that they're supposed to be deployed in. And therefore, it makes the job easier and you can then deliver an outcome. But there are lots of other use cases where specialized robots were designed for a particular task, right? Obviously, you've got people on the other side that will say, if you're doing specialized robotics, you will never get to economies of scale. Therefore, your robots will always be super expensive. Therefore, you will never be able to deliver value, which is competitive with, let's say, employing humans and so on. And that really depends on the individual cases. But trying to deploy, £250,000 worth of humanoid into a task where you would pay somebody $30,000 a year to do a job is not economically sane.
Let's say you have developed specific robots for construction work, but sites are different. Would it be able to adapt, or you have to teleoperate?
First of all, you can't deploy without teleoperation. Right? The use cases are so varied and different that in order to arrive at any sort of limited autonomy, you need to teleoperate a hell of a lot out of it. Right? And think about how autonomy has worked so far. Right? If you take a case of one of the few successful examples, when I say successful examples, Waymo, they've not arrived at full autonomy, but they've arrived at a high percentage of autonomy. It started by them driving cars and collecting data while driving cars, and then they were teleoperating cars and collecting all the data, external inputs, human reactions, and so on. And then they, on the basis of millions of hours of data, they started fine-tuning the models to actually drive the cars around and get to north of 90% autonomy. Obviously, Waymo taxis are not fully autonomous. There is nothing that is fully autonomous. If you think about it, it does still require human intervention when taxis get lost and so on. They still have teams of teleoperators in Philippines, etc. But they managed to, over a period of 22 years, they managed to build a relatively robust autonomy operating in 2 dimensions with 6 outputs, right? But it's how it worked, right? When you're looking at claims that people make about, zero-shot robotic deployment and so on, you haven't actually, we haven't seen any of that deployed on real sites with any degree of reliability. So yes, you will have to teleoperate. Secondly, you asked about robots in construction. You can design relatively universal robots, and obviously the jury's out, right? That some people will say, oh, it's a humanoid. If you look at all 3, which is a German startup that recently raised 25 mil, which is a former Arrival crew, they going for a crab or a spider shape, and I can see the value in that from a perspective of stability, but at the same time, single arm probably not ideal for construction, and you might use different form factors. But if you look at the job construction, right, where you're handling large, heavy goods, the number one challenge for you is to retain stability over a reasonably uneven ground. Right? Bipedals, we've evolved to do it, but bipedal humanoids will not give you that. So you'd need something with either a large footprint, a wheelbase or track with low center of gravity that can then handle objects, and 2, 4, 6 arms, I don't know, that might handle objects. So you could have a more or less universal robotic construction, but that doesn't mean that people have succeeded, right? What you've seen in construction is specialization taking over. So companies like Monumental, the bricklaying robot, companies like Cubot, the insulating robot, few other companies like Gravis, for example, the sort of earth-moving robots, they are moving forward because they highly specialized rather than universal.
No, even so, Tesla teleoperated their demo, and there is another robot, $20,000 robot that ships with a person. What does that tell us about this industry at this stage?
Well, I think you're referring to 1X.
Neo.
Neo robot, which, yes, it's pretty much teleoperated.
And someone controlling it from the...
with a VR,
yes.
with a VR headset. Well, first of all, that is the only way you can do it. Yeah, you can't, there are no models that can run robots in various locations in homes, in unpredictable environments with dogs, kids, mess, chaos, and so on, that can actually be autonomous. You need human teleoperation. I would turn this around and I would say, A, you can't do it in any other way, but B, this is a large-scale data collection exercise. It's not. It's a deployment, but it's a data collection exercise dressed as a service. What Neo is doing is just collecting indoor data, trying to get to a volume of data to build large enough data set that might be useful to train large foundational model or world action model or something that can then start eating away that teleoperator time and start developing some sort of autonomy. I wouldn't expect it to be in the 70 or 80% range anytime soon, but with a large enough data set, you can start moving forward in that direction.
No, when I watched our demo, I missed it, and then I was watching a review, and then somebody pointed that it's not autonomous.
Yes.
When you were watching that demo, what do you see, like as a robotic expert?
I would be looking at how well teleoperation is running. What's the sort of latency? One of my issues is the ergonomics of teleoperation. At the moment, teleoperating humanoids requires VR headsets, and which are famously nauseating, for example. And you might not be able to teleoperate the robot for more than half an hour before you get disoriented or sick and so on. The technology is not yet there to build the entire infrastructure behind the teleoperated deployment. So that's challenge number one. Ergonomics is challenge number two, the effectiveness of teleoperation. When you're teleoperating with a VR headset and if you're not wearing an exoskeleton, for example, because if you're wearing an exoskeleton, your joint movements can be mimicked by the set of slave arms, on a humanoid. But if you're not, then obviously there's a joint mismatching. There's this what's called cross-embodiment training challenge and so on, where you might be, and the teleoperator might be trying to do something, but the robot might not actually get there because of the physical constraint of the and so on. So there are lots and lots of challenges. And even when you look at those demos, if you think, oh, it's working because it's teleoperated, well, actually, that's still a lucky one when it's all working. When it's teleoperated, you still have quite a lot of challenges having that robust teleoperation infrastructure in place, the low latency, teleop setup and so on. It's challenging to even teleoperate humanoids, and forget about autonomy. Those demos are, well, I don't want to get sued, but mostly smoke and mirrors.
Okay, then on that note, Figure's AI boss went on television and said there is no teleoperation. What would you tell him?
Okay, I'm going to have to be careful here, right? But you won't get that statement from anybody who is a roboticist, from anybody who is an engineer, right? If you ask anybody who's been doing robotics for some time and who understands how robots work, right? They'll be a lot more cautious with statements they're making. Brett is a marketing guy. Yeah, his entire life he's been selling things, and he's really good at this, right? He's succeeded in raising money for Figure and I and so on. But there's more to operation than teleoperation, right? You've got motion planning, yeah, and robots can follow sequences of motions without actually being teleoperated because they're literally following a sequence, pre-planned sequences of motions. When it comes to autonomy, like walking, gait, maintaining stability and so on, well, that's edge computing working at its hardest, and that's still an extremely hard challenge. You could see that everyone's taken quite a few years to get to that point. Now they got to that point, great. The rest, Helix, which is what Figure AI claims to be their model, which is zero shot, claims that a robot knew what to do with ketchup, even though ketchup was not in their pre-training. It's like you're training the robot on a kitchen data set that contained in pre-training, millions of hours of kitchen data set. Maybe ketchup wasn't in the fine-tuning process, but it kind of had to be there in order for the data set to be large enough to do any reasonable training. So, if you could train robots on half an hour worth of data, you'd see robots everywhere around us doing things, right? The fact is we can't. So even if something's not teleoperated, it doesn't mean it's autonomous.
Okay, now, so where do you draw the line? Like keyboards were also teleoperated. There is teleoperation as a tool versus a trick to sell the product. Where do you draw the line?
Okay. First of all, let's start with the fact that I'm a founder of Qbot, but I no longer work at Qbot. I left the company 18 months ago.
We'll discuss that later.
When it comes to that particular deployment, we combined autonomy with teleoperation. Yeah, we've obviously done everything through teleoperation to start with. Then we introduced some motion planning, and then we started building autonomy when it comes to spray application. You still had to. Every robot is teleoperated as it navigates, the crawl space or the floor void, mainly because no two floor voids are the same, right? You've got spaghetti of cables and pipes, and you've got rubble and all the other things. You need a human to operate, to navigate around obstacles, to make sure that the robot doesn't tie itself in knots because you're pulling quite a big umbilical that supplies the foam and so on. So it requires a certain operator's skill and knowledge, and it also requires a lot of intervention. But then once you've locked in onto an area that you want to insulate, based on the data that's been collected, the robot can do that either autonomously or semi-autonomously or execute motion planning, which again is not autonomy, but it's not a direct intervention by the teleoperator, right? So you've got a mixture of things that you can put together in order to deliver the outcome to the customer. But you can't do it without teleoperation, right? There's just not enough data to train successful navigation in extremely constrained and messy environments.
Figure AI is at 39 billion, and other big companies, like almost every single humanoid company is over $10 billion valuation. And do you think there is a reckoning coming that that will pop this bubble. Like K-Lab is gone, and then this Cartwheel Robotics, that's also out of business.
There are some humanoid companies that are quite clear that they're only making hardware, and if you want to deploy those to do something, you need to do it yourself. So Unitree is a complex case because they make hardware, but it's a spy hardware, right? They deploy literally, CCCP agents across the world, and your job is to put them in critical areas where they could spy and snoop on you. But the fact is that Unitree is quite clear that they're just supplying you with hardware, right? And putting that into use, whether it's teleoperation or model training, whatever, is somebody else's job, right? So I would say, apart from the data collection side of things, which, one could say it's a little bit untoward, I can see that there is a reasonable amount of honesty, this is just hardware, you go and put it to use and work it out somehow. You've got companies like Agibot that will say, oh, we own the full stack, we're creating all this, simulation layer and training layer and everything else, and you can do all sorts of wonderful things with it. And then you go to, Agibot launched in London last month, you go to see demos and, you watch it all fall apart. And the only thing that works is robot dancing. And it's one of those, 6 months ago it was folding clothes and towels, and now it's dancing, and I wonder what's going to be in 6 months' time, maybe robots singing or whatever. But none of these things are useful. When we looked at demos, and this is like 2 days of demos when you're doing a product launch, right? You're going to put your best foot forward. A robot that was supposed to be kicking ball into a net, 3 meters away, kind of went on strike and folded itself into a bit. Looked like somebody crying under the shower. And then robots that were supposedly mimicking production environments. One was very heavily teleoperated because you could see that in shaking arms that, it's a teleop setup and it's quite a rudimentary one. And the other one that was, I think, executing some motion planning, kept bumping into different conveyor belts that were set up there and everything else, and kept moving things around because, again, it was executing motion planning rather than being, running perception and, on edge inference and so on. So it was I wouldn't say it was extremely disappointing because I didn't have high expectations, but it demonstrated that we can put actuators and arms and bits of metal together, but we still can't make them do things.
You mentioned Unitree. Unitree has made this hardware thing very cheap, like almost 70% cheap, and their margin is 60% up. Do you think West will be able to catch them up, or it's too late on the hardware part?
There are various theories out there, and I had a few conversations with people about it. Some people would say that it's all about the energy cost, that all the other costs can be matched. So whoever has the cheapest energy, because you can, in theory, and it's a philosophical concept rather than a practical observation, in theory you can make humanoids build humanoids. Yeah, I mean, far-fetched, but that's what a lot of people bet on, that we can have robots building robots, therefore labor costs don't matter. And the only cost that matters is the energy cost. So whoever can drive the cost of energy to the lowest point will have the sort of economic advantage in building robots. At the same time, I believe it's a very simplistic argument. If that was the case, then every country could make photovoltaics, and yet all the photovoltaic factories are in China, right? If that was the case, we could because photovoltaics are generally fully automated, gigafactories, right? So it's not as simple as that. If you look at history, every technology wave followed a very similar trajectory. Like personal computers were introduced, and everybody in the West was building PCs. IBM was famously talking about all the money being made in hardware, and yet all sorts of companies like Compaq and lots, hundreds, thousands of companies set up in the US to build personal computers. Very few of them remain, and the ones that do remain make computers in China, right? So once the Chinese have solved the manufacturing challenge, there was an extinction event in this space. And then you move a little bit forward, and you can see internet. Everybody wanted to build the internet. You had companies like Northell, Alcatel, Marconi, and everybody else, AT&T talking about building this internet infrastructure and all the hardware behind the internet, right? There was a huge wave of like, we're going to build hardware that runs the internet, we're going to milk the internet, right? And then, $2 trillion crater later, none of them are around. AT&T sort of is around because they were monopoly, it's different. But companies that rushed into like, we'll make stuff, ended up extinct because the Chinese have solved it. Same happens to photovoltaics in between 2011 and 2013, where Chinese have driven the price down 90%. I mean, we all benefited, but there's no manufacturing left in Europe and America. Similar thing is happening with cars.
EVs?
Yes. I mean, Chinese make the cheapest. I mean, this is the challenge. EVs are actually simple when you look at them, right? It's a couple of motors, batteries, and the chassis around it, and a set of wheels. They're absolutely slaughtering existing manufacturers. And if you think about automotive, it's highly automated, right? So how come they have such a large advantage? So I think that the claim that the West can win in manufacturing humanoids because humanoids can make humanoids is unsubstantiated. And I highly doubt if that will work out. The way I see this is a similar sort of cycle repeating itself as as the 3 or 4 cycles before, where Chinese have solved humanoid manufacturing at cost and to the right quality. Having said that, they can make those things. They still like computers without software, right? So somebody will have to put them to use.
No, why does this keep happening? And do you think is this the subsidies that are being given to these manufacturers in China, or maybe West can be known trust and the brain, the AI, LLM, edge computing?
China is allocating 200 billion to scaling robotics, right? And that goes right across the industry. And to be honest with you, I think that 200 billion figure is actually conservative because the several actions are being implemented simultaneously. So first of all, there's a huge amount of assistance going into all the robotics companies, including humanoids, right? State subsidies and so on. At the same time, and it's not just financial. I mean, Unitree literally was given a factory by the Chinese state. So here you go. Yeah, there's your factory. You just move it and make these things. So you've got subsidies, cash subsidies, but also lots of other assistance and so on. In addition to that, the financial ecosystem is being very heavily primed. So if you want to buy a humanoid, you're going to get a zero interest loan from a Chinese state immediately to procure them, right? So procurement of humanoids is subsidized, not just production of those. So, and it happens right across the economy. Exports are subsidized and so on and so on. So it's not just subsidies, is pumping money through the entire ecosystem, even though quite a few factories that have tried humanoids have admitted that they're not particularly useful. They don't do much, and when they do, they're a lot slower than humans. And you're talking about, moving crates around, which you could move with AMRs without problem. So kind of putting them to the wrong use case as well. But what you will have is this huge ecosystem, right, that's been given momentum, right, by the state subsidy, just like, production of silicone in US was subsidized by the state. The US state subsidized quite a lot of technologies before recently, and that's one of the reasons why they've become so successful. You get to a certain economy of scale, and at that point, unit economics makes sense. People start buying, and you get on with it. And I think that will continue. China has enough money to throw at problems. Whether humanoids solve any problems, that's a completely different question.
What would be the valuation of this industry by 2040? 40 trillions, 50 trillion, 100 trillions?
I think we'll see a bust before we see the boom, right? So right now we've got a hype cycle. We're probably somewhere towards or close to the top of the hype cycle, which is the usual trajectory where there's new technology, there's this early promise, there's the huge hype. At this point, all the VCs start pumping money into the business. And then there is this disillusionment, and valuations crash. You get a fair amount of extinction within the industry, and then somewhere towards the race to the bottom, few use cases emerge, which I can't pinpoint at the moment, but there might be a few use cases that emerge, and they sort of stabilize the valuation. So that I think there'll be obviously more companies entering the market because when you're pumping money into the market, and with VCs you're pumping money into the market, lots more companies that get created to take advantage of it. Then there will be some sort of mass extinction event driven by disillusionment, and then at some point after dust settles, we'll see few use cases emerge. Very unlikely bipedal. I'm sure there'll be wheeled humanoid-like robots, but they might not have heads. They might not, So we might broaden the definition, right? We might say, oh, that's also a humanoid. I know it's got wheels and it's just got two arms on it and nothing looks like a human, but because it's designed to do what human does, we're going to call that a humanoid. If you broaden the definition, I will see, yes, there's huge value in the market. Right? There will be, I wouldn't say 40 trillion, but there will be trillion plus market in deployment of robots to useful tasks across various industries. But they are very unlikely to resemble humanoids that currently are getting all the investment.
What percentage China will take?
I think China will produce vast majority of
80%?
robots. I would say 60 to 80%, yes.
Britain, this advanced research agency, they just gave 50 million pounds of subsidiary or investment for robot dexterity to solve this hand problem. As you mentioned, 17,000 receptors, and our brain take less than a millisecond even to make sure how much grip we need. Whoever solved the dexterity first would have an edge.
You might have several advances that have not yet occurred that can help specialized robots, grippers, hands, whatever, handle different objects and so on. You can have, for example, there is a space for soft robotics. Yeah, you've seen things like, for example, an octopus-like grippers where they wrap around objects and so on. Right, so we'll see emergence of various approaches to dexterity. So I don't think, I might be wrong, but I don't think we'll have an event where we can say there's a human hand and there's a robot hand and they match one for one, and the robot hand can do everything that the human hand does. We'll probably see various different types of grippers, from soft to liquid filled to grippers that actually are responsive there, that don't need any inference to sort of collect data, and that might automatically react to deflection in different ways. You've already seen, a lot of grippers on the market, if you sort of press them at the midpoint, will wrap around just because of the way they were structured, for example. So I think we'll see a lot happening on the gripper side, but I don't believe it will be like, oh, look at it, this is the hand and it does what human hand does. It will be a various array of different technologies that can be applied to different applications.
By the way, there is a perception out there, and the people think that like the way GPT solved some use cases really well, like the content creation or the generation or all that stuff, a model will come out and it will solve all these problems for robotics. Robot will be able to take their decisions really fast because of the inference of the better model or something. We have been talking about data gap. What do you think?
This is not a linear progression that we're talking about here. Let's just take a step back and look at large language models and how neural networks work in general, right? When ChatGPT started being useful, it was when it was trained on, vast amounts of data. Yeah? We're talking about a whole internet of data. And text is one-dimensional. Yeah? So we're talking about neural network that's been trained on vast amounts of one-dimensional data. in order to generate the next word and do it well. Okay? This is one-dimensional data. Now, when we're talking about physical environment, not only are we talking about the three-dimensional data with things like distances and and so on, with physics, yeah, where we have motion and momentum and gravity and so on, with all the other sensory inputs. So one is your sort of tactile, sensory feedback, but there's smells, there is different shades and so on. We're talking about an environment which is at least 5 orders of magnitude more complex, because it's not only 3 dimensions in physics, but we haven't worked out how to convert touch into digits yet. So at least 5 orders of magnitude more complex, right? And obviously, as you grow in the complexity of data, you sort of have to square the complexity of training and the compute demand. So when it comes to arriving at the sort of ChatGPT moment for physical AI, like what Jensen Huang says, I mean, obviously he would say that because once we've arrived at, and if NVIDIA is selling chips to do that, they're probably worth 10 quadrillions or something like that, because the amount of computational power is so vast that A, we don't have space on Earth to do it with current models. B, we don't have the energy to run it using current models. Maybe quantum computing could help when it gets commercialized at scale. But that developing that sort of ChatGPT level autonomy for physical AI, it's so vastly more challenging than doing a decent neural network that can, do your coding or whatever because it's been trained on internet data. That I just can't see us delivering that as humanity over the next 10, 15 years.
Do you think synthetic data or these synthetic demonstrations can help to train these?
The synthetic data was the last year's hype, right? When people thought that we can achieve all of that with synthetic data, and all we ended up with was the sim to real gap, where things work in simulation, trained on synthetic data, and then when you try to when you upload the model onto even a set of arms, right? Forget it, the robot that actually moves around and does something, it breaks down 9 out of 10 cases, right? And still in very controlled environments. We're talking about training a robot on synthetic data. 2 arms fixed to the desk, right? And you run through millions of hours of training. It works in the simulation every time. You upload it onto a robot. And even in that very controlled environment of a small desk with few objects they have to handle, you still break down 9 out of 10 times, right? And that's the environment that doesn't change, right? So the synthetic data gave us a sim to real gap. Yeah, the fact that this year's hype is paying people in third world countries to wear iPhone cameras or GoPros on their foreheads to record everything that they do. So that's the hype of 2026 in this assumption that will solve everything. And I've seen we've seen companies raise 50 mil fundraisers. Was it this week or last week? On the back of we collecting data from people that just go around the daily life wearing a camera, and then the promise. From that, we will build the data set to train robots, right? That will fail. And then the next year, there'll be another hype, are we going to build it in so-and-so way? The fact is that people underestimate the size of the challenge. And it's easy, you read a paper at university and go like, I've got a brainwave, we're going to solve this, And people that have been doing sort of machine learning for years look at this and go like, okay. Clearly, you've never done it before, have you? None of these things will succeed. Right? Robotics generally is for masochistic people that wake up to fail repeatedly every single day and on occasion succeed. It's not a space where you can simultaneously solve everything and then have like this 0-shot, fully generalizable model, purely because we would need to, with current models, and with current approaches, we'd probably need, an energy of the entire galaxy to run that, So it's not feasible.
On that point, by the way, Stanford and NVIDIA, they had this collaboration where they gave 5 minutes of muscle memory and 3 orders of magnitude more to a robot.
You could move technology forward in narrow specialized fields, right? For example, I think there is a lot to be achieved when you're looking at grasping by actually creating by putting together grasping technologies that can react on immediately based on touch or based on sense without actually inference, for example, and can you touch something and it grabs it and so on. There are lots of people researching fluid dynamics models, trying to achieve that with soft robotics, etc. There will be advances, but the field of what we're trying to do, to go back to first principles, we're trying to recreate a human being, that has evolved over millions of years through adaptation and so on, and for all intents and purposes is more or less perfect, right? I can't think how it could be improved and so on. And we're trying to replicate that with, billion-dollar budgets. That's nothing. Over years, that's nowhere near close enough. So some companies will manage to solve a small proportion of the challenge somewhere, but it's not something that can actually just happen from 0 to 1. It will take decades. And by the time we get there, it won't look like what we expect it to be. It will be several different strands specialized around different compute requirements, different task groups, different environment conditions. And at that point, we'll arrive at something that's useful in some cases.
On the data part, I think which humanoid company have the edge? Tesla, maybe. They can win when it comes to data collection and training. They're the most capable.
I need to ponder. So last year at Tesla, it was January, AGM, Elon Musk was asked about, the challenges of solving, humanoids and so on. And obviously a lot of that valuation started riding on humanoids and so on. And what Elon Musk said was making humanoids useful is $1 trillion challenge, or $500 billion challenge. It's also in the same AGM where he said that Tesla was going to be a $10 trillion company, and everybody sort of latched on to that. But what I took out of it was that he expected to spend minimum 500 billion, 500 with a B, right? Trying to train humanoids to be remotely useful at things. And he did say that it's 1,000 times more complex challenge than getting cars to drive, right? So he did say some sensible things. At the same time, I would still take that. I'll take that 500 billion cost as coming from the guy who said that we were going to have Roadster, 4 years ago and took deposit from people for that Roadster, which is still nowhere to be seen. So he's still extremely optimistic, right? And yet he puts a number at $500 billion challenge for his company to actually try to make them useful, right? So when Elon Musk says that's going to cost him at least $500 billion, I would probably, add a zero and say he's not wrong. He's been not wrong on several fronts before. When you've got people saying, we'll build this large foundational model that can generalize across all the human tasks and so on, and we only need sort of 400 million for that, they are out by 4 orders of magnitude.
Okay, what do you think about 1x hand? It went viral, 10 million views, and their claim was it's near human level dexterity. And iRobot CEO Brooke said it's pure fantasies.
Well, first of all, I never shook that hand, so I don't know. I've seen a video showing that it can lift a hell of a lot. Payload is a big thing, and obviously I've seen all the sort of dexterity, which claims to be beyond human because it can bend backwards and so on. So it's a great piece of engineering. Can it last more than a week? That's if you think about something that had to become so complex, right, in order to achieve something resembling, human operation, I'd be looking at it as a robotist thinking, I wonder what mean time between failure is, and so on. But the fact is, I don't know if it works. I've seen the demo, it looks great. I don't want to be going around and saying, oh, it doesn't work, because again, I don't know if it works. I don't know if it doesn't work. I can't say. It looks very complex. And I don't know if it can survive more than a week in normal environment. I mean, the beauty about human body is that we heal. Yeah. I don't know if that hand, can lift 10 kilograms more than twice, for example. I just don't know. Yeah.
NVIDIA just launched this Cosmo 3 Edge. It's a $250 board and 2 billion parameters for reasoning. Do you think that would help to make humanoids better?
I don't think that will. If you build a humanoid with that board with that on board, that will make them better. You need a lot more compute on that front. But what it could do is help to stimulate innovation, which we need to even start tackling the physical AI autonomy challenge. Right? We're talking about the challenge so vast that we don't even know at this stage how we can begin to tackle that. So with that sort of cheap, cost-effective compute and those models that can be used by anybody, students and college kids and so on, we're making it easier for people to innovate and come up with ideas and hopefully build more efficient models or different models that can start helping us to tackle that challenge.
Everybody wants to buy the finished work, and we have seen software as a service. Do you see robot as a service? What would be the commercial model?
I've been running Robot as a Service for over 10 years, right? At Qbot, we've provided our partners with fully functioning robotic solution that contain not just hardware, but also, software, teleops, controls, fleet management. And they were delivering outcomes to customers, charging a few £1,000s, and we were taking like 15, maybe 20% of it. So in my view, that is the only way to commercialize robotics, right? Is to have something like software as a service or even work as a service. So there is Sequoia recently, or Julian Beck from Sequoia published his view on the next $1 trillion company formations, where he stated that the next generation of companies reaching $1 trillion will not be selling hardware or software. They will be selling work. Yeah. And if you think about what you said earlier about agents being able to do work, we'll see that service offering evolve to robots being able to do the work. And at that point, it's not robot as a service. You're not providing somebody with a robot and charging a service fee. You're actually providing somebody with an outcome. Yeah. So I see this as a model that will be extremely successful. If you look back, it's sort of how it all repeats itself over every technology cycle. When we had personal computers come into the market first, people focused on making them, but actually the ones that enabled people to generate outcomes from them, developing spreadsheets or word processing or graphic design and so on, were the ones that captured most value, right? And I think with humanoids or with robots in general, you'll see a similar model emerge where hardware will commoditize because the Chinese will do it at such a cost that, unless you're specializing extremely, you'll have to just do it at cost. Hardware would commoditize. I think models will commoditize as well. Every month you've got a new model coming out and so on. And I know people are putting a lot of money into models, but I think they will commoditize. Where you will see the value being created is companies putting all of that, hardware and models and everything else, and the infrastructure behind it to deliver value to customers or outcomes to customers. So customers won't be buying a robot or won't be buying a service. They'll just be buying work, right? So if you see, it's almost like an employment agency, right? There'll be this model where companies will evolve into managing fleets of robots, thousands of them, to put them to particular tasks and literally charge like, a human salary, a fraction of human salary. I don't know, you'll see that arrive at some sort of point, but it will be a fully managed solution, right? It's not like you're buying a robot and then you're looking at guarantee, what do I do if an arm breaks, or what if I do if the software update fails? What about cybersecurity? How do I deal with that? There is so much around robotic deployment, regulatory, safety, cybersecurity, and keeping it updated if you're looking at production, right? People change production sometimes every shift. Yeah, there are new products coming out. So it's not like you can buy a robot, put it on a production line and go like, yeah, you do it. And so because you need to continuously adapt, it won't work as a capital expenditure. It can only work as a fully managed service where a startup business, a company delivers that service to a manufacturing floor, but they're literally taking on the labor supply side of things. Right? So there'll be like a labor force supplier that happens to use robots in order to get the job done, right? But at the same time manages everything from hardware to models to training to Teleop support to maintenance to, replacing batteries every now and again because they die over time and so on and so on. So once you see those specialized companies emerge, I think we'll see a much, much, much quicker commercialization. But the problem with that, obviously, is that if you do that, you're taking on all the risk. At the moment, within the market, this everybody works in sort of consultative approach and so on. It's like, you just, we'll provide you with this autonomy service or whatever, but now you own this and you take a risk. I think once new businesses or new entities have solved how to take on all of that risk, manage it, ensure the compliance, and safety and everything else, and just deliver the outcome that people need, we'll see an explosion in adoption. People would love to automate that, but you're actually working with tips of your fingers for most of the time. You don't even see what you're doing, right? Where you're pulling wires behind the bus bars and so on, and putting them into those different devices like circuit breakers and so on. You can't possibly deploy a robot to do that, whether it was Dexterous or Grippers or whatever. It's too hard, right? So we've looked at lots of jobs when it's like can't be done. Not in the next 5 years, maybe not in the next 10. Yeah. And probably beyond that. So what you'll see is the sort of the boring, mundane jobs being automated with robots, yeah, whether it's humanoids or mobile manipulators or whatever. The ones that you don't want to do in the first place. And to be honest with you, the way I see this is the fact that you have a shitty job is keeping you in a shitty job. You know why? Your boss will not let you progress, do some training, move on to a better job because they don't have anybody to do your shitty job. Yeah. So it's actually you being inversely oppressed, right? Because of the shittiness of your job and nobody wanting to replace you when you move on, you are literally constrained to that one job, right? The moment we can automate those repetitive shitty jobs, right? We're actually freeing up people to move up the food chain, so to speak, get some training, do something more demanding, earn more money, right? Have a more rewarding career, right? But at the moment, because we've got all of those repetitive, shitty jobs that need doing, and we keep putting people to do it, we kind of have to keep them there, which is literally like an inverse oppression.
Do you think is there any physical job which is safe for, like, say, for next 20 years, and any job which will be gone less in 3 or 5 years?
If you consider driving a physical job, that would obviously
that is a physical
job. That will be mostly automated over the next 10 to 20 years. I mean, we can see that happening now, right? It's all. I mean, it'll take time. It needs a lot of data, and we'll have all sorts of issues that will set back. Look at DLR. That's been. Trains have been running autonomously for years, right? Tube, not so much, not because there isn't a technology to do it, but there is a human resistance, right? So moving things around, cars, vans, tracks, trolleys, forklifts, taxis, trains, and so on, will be automated to a much larger extent than it is now. So it's definitely that, right? If you're an Uber driver, learn a new skill.
As we are talking about physical jobs, construction is the hardest one, right? This is where you went. And why we are not solving these type of hard jobs first rather than, laundry folding? What's the point of,
Well, it's a lot easier to run a laundry folding demo than to run a plasterboard fixing demo, right? If you think about laundry folding, I don't want to take away from achievements of laundry folding, but we're looking at a soft deformable item placed on a hard surface that you can grasp in several places, yeah. And as you move it, it moves with you, right? And you fold it, it's compliant, right? So there are several ways to succeed folding laundry, right? When it comes to hard jobs like construction, you're not working on the tabletop in a controlled environment with something which is very compliant and will just follow your movement, right? You're on construction environments which are messy, which are demanding, uneven, with different lighting conditions and so on. And on top of that, there's quite often only one way to successfully execute the task, right? If you're fixing the plasterboard to the wall, if you 3-4 millimeters off target, you're off target, you failed, right? So that's number one, right? It's much easier to run a demo folding towels or clothes or whatever. Number two is construction tasks are extremely hard, yeah, and then you can see, I can pick up an impact driver, and without looking at it, I can adjust it to sit in my hand better. Yeah, if I pick it up off center, if it's facing the wrong way, I pick it up and I just immediately adjust it because I know how, which way I want to face it and so on, right? I can walk up the ladder with 5 screws in my mouth, and then, holding something with one arm, yeah, and then execute the tasks and so on. It's not something, just walking up the ladder while holding something and it's almost like it's acrobatically impossible for robots to do, right? Before you even say how hard is the job, right? It's even getting in the position with the job. It's like it's a different level of complexity, right? It's where I can see robots making inroads. You've obviously got robots in construction now, right? You've got Monumental that's recently raised 32 mil, included from Kosla and amongst others. And you've got other companies that have been relatively successful. Obviously, you've got Gravis, which has been moving Earth around, but you've got other companies, the former sort of Waymo people going into construction, again, moving Earth around, right? There are areas where you can deploy in construction if you narrow them enough, yeah. And I think there is more room when it comes to offsite construction, where you've got highly repeatable items moving down the production line, boxes where you need to put insulation in between the studs or maybe pull cables through, but actually it's all rinse and repeat. So you're literally following a plan, right, within a very well-defined environment, 3D accurate environment where you know exactly where things are and so on. So we'll see growing adoption of robotics in offsite, where environments are semi-structured, right, rather than on-site. And then we'll probably see some adoption on-site when it comes to tasks that not necessarily replace anybody, but make people's work more efficient, right? So let's say 40% of time on site is spent on not actually doing anything. You're walking around looking for your tools, or you're looking for stuff that's supposed to have arrived, but it says there that it's arrived, but you don't know where. So, for example, moving goods around on sites, I can see that being gradually automated with, it could be armed AMR robots. So it could just be AMRs with bushels on them, going around construction sites, delivering stuff, to location. So we'll see these sort of companies emerge trying to do this. Probably larger sites adopting that. But when it comes to actually humans, holding power tools and making change with those power tools, that's, I would say, you're not going to see much happening there within the next 10 years.
Maybe the robot can have 6 arms,
Yeah. Again, I would always go back to trying to make sure that whatever solution that you're coming up with is appropriate for the challenge, right? So it could be that the 6-armed robot is perfect for fixing plasterboard, but it might also be that the plasterboard 8x4 size is suboptimal for robotic application. You might have larger or smaller sheets emerge that work better with robots and so on. In construction, we've built things, the whole supply chain is built around a human being able to lift, a bag of 25 kilos, more or less maximum, human being able to hold something which is 4 feet, 4 foot across and so on. Maybe we'll see more adoption when we start rethinking that, what if we didn't have a human form, what if we could have any form? Would we then, how would we design the components that go into construction? Some companies are trying to do that. All3 is trying to redesign everything vertically in construction, right? So the way buildings are designed, the way the buildings are manufactured, and then the way the buildings are put together. It's a huge challenge. Yeah? I sympathize with some of the approach because, if you want to put buildings together with robots, then you probably have to make them different. And if you're making them different, then you probably have to design them different. So you kind of see it's sort of, you're forced into being fully vertically integrated. Yeah. Having said that, how much money is required to build that fully integrated company that can design, manufacture, and build buildings and do all of that within unit economics that actually makes sense? I don't have an answer for that. I know that they've raised, I think, 25 million recently, but I think you've seen Katera in US. They were valued at 2 billion at some point, and that went badly wrong. So automation in construction, innovation in construction, robotics in construction are very big challenges. Not many companies have succeeded. Few have, like Skanska, can actually build off-site and make money on that. But most of the companies that have tried sort of failed. So, and in this case, we're not just looking at building off-site, but we're looking at designing and then manufacturing of robots. So you might need not 25 mil, but 25 billion to sort of get to that point, right? But as I said earlier on, if you redesign the process to suit robots, whatever they might be, you might have a higher chance of success.
You mentioned something about Ukraine war before, and the cheap drones became the deadliest weapon in that war. And do you see humanoids like Legged or Wheelie or whatever carrying a weapon soon?
Well, first of all,
at scale, not just one or two.
As an engineer and roboticist and a designer and lots of other things that I've done, I actually have an issue with the idea of A, building a humanoid, and B, getting that humanoid to carry something that was designed for humans, because we can't change our actuators or end effectors, right? Yeah. So you're adding the complexity that's unnecessary, right? If you're asking a humanoid to grasp something like an impact driver, right? You're making that job 10 times harder than if it could just have an end effector that would serve that function, right? So when you say humanoids carrying weapons, I probably don't see that as a sensible thing, because it's just, it has to grasp it, it has to point it in the right direction, it has to, find a trigger and so on. But there already are robots, that move around battlefields that can fire weapons and can do so autonomously. It's like robots can drop, obviously, grenades on people and so on, but there is an emergence of those lots of tracked vehicles. And famous case probably came out last month, where a single robot held a village for 6 weeks or something, against the Russians, just because it was able to point a gun and shoot in a direction, right? So you see the adoption, but like I said earlier on, the Ukrainians have tried, humanoids because, bipedals can navigate, rough terrain and so on, and clearly stated that has failed, that they can't match tracked or wheeled vehicles. So yes, autonomous robots deployed in battlefields, absolutely. Will there be humanoids?
Maybe arms will be replaced with built-in machine guns or something like that, heavy stuff. Anyways, what is your personal red line on this? Would you build one?
I'm not into building humanoids, no.
No. Robots with weapons or weapon robots, whatever you want to call them.
It's not the space that I focus on, right? So I focus on industrialization, right? So my let's start from philosophical approach, right? The way I see robots really making a positive impact on our society is if they enable us to reindustrialize our Western civilization, right? We have sort of forgotten how to make things, and we've outsourced all that thing making to others, and we've become a lot poorer in effect, or less capable to respond to crisis and geopolitical events and so on. I believe that deploying robots at scale, we can call them humanoids. I don't see that being humanoid. It will be a moving robots with arms that can, inference on edge. I believe that deploying robots at scale in manufacturing will enable us to rebuild our industries, right, and bring our supply chains back home, and enable production at almost like the Chinese cost, right, but flexible, scalable, cost-effective, and by, let's say, 10xing manufacturing, we can 3x the jobs, even though we've automated a lot of it. Because if you look at history, this is what happened when textiles have grown in the UK. The most of yes, per a meter of fabric, made, the UK ended up, or Great Britain ended up employing 10,000 fewer spinsters, right? But at the same time, the production exploded, and then the entire employment in the enabling industry exploded, rails and, canals and everything else, building the infrastructure to carry those things around and so on. I think deploying robots at scale, in manufacturing, will enable us to reindustrialize in a similar fashion, right? Just rebuilding our infrastructure, enabling us to make things locally, rebuilding the skill set that we've lost because we've sort of outsourced all the manufacturing and so on. And it will make for much stronger, much more equal economies. And I think that's where they can have the biggest impact. Will these countries need to be defended against external threats? But I'm sure they will. And there will be other people focusing on that space. But I think the biggest societal impact you can have when you reindustrialize a country.
Industrialization, I see that point. But robots, the reason these humanoids are very fascinating and the demo and the laundry, all that stuff, because people think one day these robots can babysit or can take care of your senior citizens or all that stuff. Would you let a humanoid or a robot or whatever pick up that sort of chores for you?
You might not even call them robots at some stages. You will see, let's say, intelligent furniture, or whatever. Think about it. We get so obsessed by trying to copy a person, whereas actually, let's say you look at assisted living, what you've got when it comes to assisted living is improving mobility, improving independence, improving access to certain goods and services for people who are no longer as able as they used to be. Do you need to duplicate a person and have another large object, 100 kilos, 80 kilos heavy, that has safety issues, that can fail, that can fall on people or whatever? Or would you rather say, we are now, thanks to robotics, we are surrounded by intelligent buildings, intelligent furniture that literally does equivalent job for you, but it can help people move around because your chair moves where you need to, your transfer to the bed might actually be like you just get, handled by a chair into the bed. Your bathing, might have an intelligent bathroom that might do all that. Instead of you trying to do that, it might actually get you washed in an effective way. You don't need to introduce this big lump of metal, which is bipedal, which is 90-minute battery time, which is, you don't even know how to shut it down safely, right? Or do you say, we now have assisted living intelligence that the building can take care of, an older elderly in this assisted living setup, and actually it's based around mobile furniture, it's based around, because what you're trying to solve, I mean, again, it's about being appropriate, right? You're solving mobility issues, you're solving access issues, you're solving supervision issues. We can deliver that, with just improving objects around you, and, your chair. We have moving chairs, they're called wheelchairs, they're robotic wheelchairs and so on. If you draw a line of these things getting more capable, they could do that one function. Again, yes, we're talking about specialization, but that's the only way to do something really, really, really well, is when you focus on specialization. So I believe that there will be huge impact on elderly and so on, but it might not take the form that we all seem to be sort of somehow hoodwinked into believing.
This story, like in Japan, in Osaka Mall, there was this wheelie robot, and a group of children came together and started kicking it. And now the researcher has made it like, if you see children, run from that place, something like that. It was a very funny story. Why do you think when we see a robot with wheels or humanoid shape or anything like that, and it was just a simple robot, picking up stuff, all that, do we need to teach our children, or do we need to, learn about how to interact with them or something?
I think...
And they really enjoyed it, by the way.
Yeah, so, I mean, have you seen Chappie, the South African movie about the robot that gains intelligence? That robot gets a lot of abuse as well, right? There's a quite heartbreaking scene when the robot gets beaten up badly, and you feel for it, right? To be honest with you, right, this subject matter that you've just raised deserves university degree courses to look into and so on. It's a very deep subject, right? And you could look at it from different perspectives. You can say, we need to educate people to interact with robots better. Or you can say, well, actually, maybe if the robot had a form factor that was cuddly or inviting, or it invoked pleasant feelings, then it wouldn't get abused, or whatever. So we've looked at this. We've looked at form factors, right? Is there a form factor that makes a robot more likely to be abused than not, right? Is there an appearance that we could give robot? Or is there maybe a way of, it's like, well, if you tip me over, I will be sad, right? It's like, rather than, it's an object, right? So, and you obviously there are lots of examples, from, let's say, Disney and so on, when you see robots that are sort of cuddly, or, B-Max from Big Hero 6, or Bernie from WALL-E, and there are lots of robots out there that are just like, oh, so cute that you probably wouldn't abuse them, right? But at the same time, how does that sort of human-robot interaction, what governs it, right? What psychological issues or motivations are behind it? It's a huge subject area. I think that deserves a lot more research, by literally universities focusing the entire fields of research into that. But I see this as, in a simplistic way. You can have a robot that looks in a way that you just don't want to hurt it, because it will be like, it looks so cuddly and harmless or whatever. Or you could have a robot that looks like, don't mess with me. Yeah. And then you're like, yeah, I'm not gonna tip that one over. It looks like it could beat me up. You could have very strict regulations. If you vandalize a robot, there is, you're paying a fine or going to prison or whatever. Although we're probably moving away from the whole prison thing at the moment, but that's a different subject.
Yeah.
So various ways of you could deal with it in various ways. I think it's at the moment we don't know what makes people beat up robots, right? But there are teenagers and others that vandalize trains and other things. So maybe it's a people thing rather than a robot thing.
It's interesting thing from Bill Gates. He says that any job that a robot, humanoid, or whatever you are going to call it, is taking, there must be a tax on it. Let's say it was a sorting job or something. There must be a robot tax. What do you think about that?
Well, it will happen. I mean, if you think about the government, especially our government, right? The one thing that that keeps them awake at night is trying to devise new ways of taxing people, and businesses and so on, right? So let's say we provide a labor service to a customer, right? And we supply labor to a manufacturing site. It's 100 robots doing jobs, right? Obviously, when we invoice monthly, we put VAT on that. Yeah, so there's a 20% VAT on that as well immediately. If you were an employee, there would be a PPE tax, and pension and so on. Robots might not need pensions, but I can see government introducing law that where robots are deployed, and then you have to kind of work out. We're talking about fixed robots, production robots, arms, or is a robotic arm a robot, or does it have to be a two-armed robot? Does it have to be mobile? Does it need to have inference, or whatever? But I can see government coming out with all sorts of ways to tax it, because that's what governments do, And obviously, I've got my own very strong feelings about it, which probably not subject of this podcast, but it will come, and then the business will come up with various ways of trying to go around it, so they can actually operate.
Brain is built in America, and hardware is built in China. Where would we stand in 2040, like Britain, United Kingdom?
Some say we'll be a third world country. Look, the UK government has a habit of announcing tiny initiatives with huge fanfare and then failing to deliver them, right? Even the whole data center adoption in the UK, right, with great government announcements, is completely on hold because data centers can't connect to the grid. They can't secure the power. They can't, and the announcements, I mean, the local authority announcements were like, oh, we're building this huge 70 megawatt, 70 megawatt data center. But the planning condition says that you need to source your own supply. You can't draw it from the local grid or whatever. In the UK, you wait 8 years for grid connection. You can build an offshore power station, an offshore wind turbine, field, and then have it sit around for 4 years because the grid connection isn't there, right? So we are so bad at infrastructure that we can't even deliver those tiny announcements about, 14 billion spent on data centers. And even those things can't happen because we are incapable of integrating that into our power grid. And at the same time, you've got China that's pumping 200 billion into, one industry, right?
Building artificial sun to have unlimited energy and so many other things. Yeah. Okay. So what would you recommend to a 16-year-old right now to learn for next 5 years?
Physics, engineering. These are the hardcore skills that will ensure that you actually do have work, right? And I've seen this even in there's an internally famous case. When you're a roboticist, you laugh about it. There's a company building humanoids on wheels, and they put a prototype together and then set it for production. They've completed the design and they've already targeted production at scale and built all the supply chain around it and tooling and so on. And when it came to demonstrating it, the moment it fully erected itself, it tipped over because it was nobody thought of physics and gravity when they were designing it. So even in current fields that actually work in robotics, you can see that physics and engineering leave a lot to be desired. So hard sciences, especially around engineering, mechanical engineering, design engineering, and physics, I believe are still going to hold up strong. I wouldn't talk about software because we've got no idea where that will land, but it looks like, anybody can code now. Yeah. Lots of people have different opinions, But when it comes to hard engineering subjects, I think they have great future.
A young man in Poland building sites. It's you. So how did you end up becoming a serial entrepreneur? What brought you to Britain?
I think it's an addiction. I think some people are just relentless builders, and this has always been me. As a kid, I had this project of building a submarine. Thank God I never got it to test it because it wouldn't have ended up well. I was halfway through building my own car as a teenager. I filed my first patent at the age of 13. It made into some sort of, national magazine called Młody Technik. And I could never stop. I've always had this mind that, this is wrong, there's a better way of doing it, and so on. And quite often I managed to prove myself right. So when COVID started, I kind of had this beautiful mind moment when I was like, they all wrong. It's airborne and it's because of X. And I did a deep dive and spent a few good months, researching the subject, published academic papers, won awards for best contribution to science and art of building service engineering, got referenced in government guidance afterwards, and so on. So I've always had this very critical eye to like how things are set up and whether they work in the way whether that's an optimal way of working and so on. And I've always had this relentless addiction to build things, right? And I think that the challenge, which over time you realize as you grow older, is putting that to best use. Focusing that energy and this addiction to build on things that can actually have the biggest impact, right? On society, where you can build a big scalable business and so on. So that's that. But when it comes to Poland, I sort of grew up in Poland to an extent, and then at some point I was like, I'm done with that, and literally just packed my stuff, got on a bus with 100 quid in my pocket in 1994, and arrived in the UK. And I didn't know anybody in the UK. I didn't speak English, and it was just one of those. You just put yourself out there, and things will work out. So I guess that in itself is quite entrepreneurial. If you got somebody who can just randomly, move somewhere else without any links or family or friends, and then just get at it, it probably demonstrates that sort of will to risk everything just for the sake of, learning more.
2 years back, you were removed as a CEO and was given CTO title, and then in between Christmas and New Year of 2024, you resigned. Young entrepreneurs, they never see this coming, and would you like to share that story, or what are the lessons?
Well, it happens to a lot of people, when they've built a company and then they part ways under whatever circumstances where things haven't worked out. If that is to be a cautionary tale, I would wind the clock back 10 years, at which point we actually lost the company. We just didn't know about it, right? We were raising...
Who is we?
Me and my co-founders, right? So it was, I founded Qbot with an Imperial College professor. We were sort of squatting at the Skempton building at Imperial. And then another co-founder joined us who went through Imperial as well. And we were fundraising. And we were building a robotics company in 2012, right? It's crazy. Like, nobody would invest in robotics then. It was not a sexy subject. And we've come across one investor that was prepared to put some money in and put forward a term sheet that our lawyers told us not to sign. Yeah, that term sheet had extremely controlling conditions to it. Right? And the lawyers had made a simple observation, like, if you sign these terms, you are not going to be in control of this company. Yeah. And in the end, we did sign those terms, right? We took some money, and it wasn't a lot of money. It was like 50 grand, right? But we had, Innovate UK funding lined up, and we just needed to show something and so on. What that term sheet meant, and that's for young entrepreneurs, if you want to learn something, was that the investors that came in at that time with 50 grand, I mean, we've raised over 10 million of investments since. Nobody came on those terms, right? So the veto rights that we've handed over to that investor, the control rights that we handed over to that investor meant that we could not control the strategy of the business. We could not control the execution, the markets, whatever. We were not in charge, right? So those investors could place, could decide, we would just put a CEO here. We get rid of this CEO, we'll put another CEO in place, and then 3 months later, another CEO. At one point, we've gone through a succession of 3 CEOs in a year, right? And we were just like passengers watching all this unfold because we were not in control, right? So I don't want to dive deep into the details, but actually you can link it all back to that moment where we handed over control to the company we haven't built yet to somebody for 50 grand. Yeah. And we were never able to regain control of that. And, at that time you might think, well, but obviously we both want the same thing. Yeah. We want this company to be a success. Our investors want this company to be a success. Therefore, our objectives are aligned. Yeah. Well, not necessarily, right? You might want to be building a sustainable business, whereas your investor might be looking at, how do I represent the highest value of this company on my assets under management,
yes,
at the highest possible level, so I can be seen as successful or whatever, and they can make strategic decisions based on their asset under management valuation rather than the sustainability of the company, right? And at that point, you might completely be trying to achieve opposite things, right? So bear that in mind, that if you're building something, right, there might be a sacrifice in not taking money from some people that make you suffer a bit more. Yeah. And obviously when you're looking at that check, you're just like, I just want that money. Yeah. I just want that money. I really want that money. But actually rushing here without good legal advice, which we just ignored it. Yeah. Without good legal advice, other things, that you could look at, which is, participating rights, ratchets and so on. It's really easy to write yourself in a situation where you're not in control of your business, or when you exit for tens of millions, you might actually not see a penny. That's another thing that I've seen a lot of founders fall into, the trap of, 2x, participating rights and so on, where, you take 10 million, but actually those investors now need to get the first 20 million from your sale. And then you take that money twice, and then you get to sale for, 48. And before you know, you get 25,000 for 10 years of building. It's a cautionary tale. For us, it was to control the company.
Who else left? Like you left the company and the co-founders as well, or are they still there?
The co-founder that I mentioned exited before me.
Okay.
Like a couple of years before me. That was also very rough and turbulent.
One more question. Why did you choose that period? What were you thinking between the Christmas and the New Year?
I didn't choose.
Okay.
It was a very tense situation. We all knew, to be honest with you, it's not just me. Majority of Khubaib employees left around the same time.
These are just some quick question, one line or one word.
Mm-hmm.
Space data centers, genius or distraction?
I think if we want to solve physical AI autonomy over the next sort of 20, 30 years, we will need to carpet the solar system with AI, with data centers in space, because I just can't see us unless quantum computing solves it all. But I believe that we will need that compute. The funny thing is, if you look back, we've always been skeptical of the amount of compute that we were going to need next year, the year after, or the year after that. We've always grown into it. Yeah. So I think it's a shape of things to come. And it might be the most efficient way to do it.
Okay, AI bubble, pop, which year or never?
Will be a huge reckoning in generative AI space when companies like OpenAI, there will be a reckoning in generative AI space when OpenAI and Anthropic start raising prices to, justify their IPOs and start going for profit, right?
It's getting cheaper.
It's going to get more expensive, in my view. And we'll see a lot of wrapper companies fold. Yeah, so I think there'll be several waves of AI bust, right, or bubble bursting.
AGI, which year or never?
2030s.
Tesla Optimus, theater or product?
What's my insurance? I'd rather not say.
Okay. Figure AI, $39 billion valuation. What do you think?
Theranos.
China robot war on the hardware specifically.
I think China will control most of the robot manufacturing.
Okay. Your robots, how many sites by 2030?
Hundreds, 10,000 robots deployed.
Britain's first $1 trillion company. Let me make it more specific. In your lifetime, yes or no?
Yes.
Self-driving car across London tomorrow, yes or no?
There's lots of Waymos in London already, just not self-driving.
This is the last question. This is Inference Podcast. The reason your company exists, my company exists, is because of the inference. So I want you to give me your inference, one specific prediction about robot industry, and where do you see your IRA company, let's say in 2035?
Prediction when it comes to what's useful on the inference side, I would say small specialized models. I believe they'll be a lot more successful than sort of large foundational models. Where I see ERA in 2035 is helping to reshore manufacturing into the UK by changing the way we make things. Thank you.